This is BBC Radio 4. Now, The Moral Maze, live with Michael Burke.
Good evening. Sex and drugs tonight, rock and roll next week. Actually, the arguments are deeper than just sex and drugs. Really at issue is what should be a crime, whether it has to have a victim, and how victimhood is defined. MPs are calling for the laws on prostitution to be changed, making the crime to be buying sex, not selling it. Implicit in this is the presumption that paying for sex amounts to violence against the prostitute. The other argument is over whether to legalise the use of cannabis. That campaign hinges on the idea that it cannot be a crime because it doesn't have a victim, and that the law creates problems rather than prevents them. Overshadowing both arguments is the unlikely figure of John Stuart Mill, a dry, stooped intellectual in a frock coat, bald as a doorknob, dead this century and a half. His philosophical assertion that the only reason power can rightly be exercised over anybody against his will is to prevent harm to others has proved one of the most persuasive ideas of our age. So, what constitutes a crime? Who's the victim? And where do we draw the line between disapproving and forbidding? That's our Moral Maze tonight. Our panel: Anne McElvoy, Public Policy Editor of The Economist, the former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Portillo, Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas, and the Anglican priest and controversialist Giles Fraser. Our last witness is Dr. Sean Gabb, who's Director of the Libertarian Alliance, writer, broadcaster and academic. What do these issues tell you about liberty and licence? Is libertarianism triumphant, do you think, or is John Stuart Mill revolving in his grave?
Is libertarianism triumphant? No, it isn't. If you look at a very small front on gay issues, there has been a very welcome lifting of legal restrictions over the past quarter of a century.
But more broadly?
But I'm afraid the gay liberalisation has not been due to libertarianism running rampant. It's been due to the activities of a very effective interest group. If you look to the rights of shooters, of smokers, of DIY enthusiasts, or of anyone trying to run a business, you can see that the country has become far more authoritarian and indeed oppressive over the past 25 years.
Anne McElvoy?
What is essentially wrong, to your mind, with paternalist authoritarianism within bounds? What's so bad about the idea that we look out for each other a bit?
Well, I would stand with John Stuart Mill's central point, which is that over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Now, we've been talking about victimless crimes. I do not regard an act as a crime unless there is an identifiable victim. All you have in the absence of a victim is a pseudo-crime, or to be more blunt, you have an unjust command.
Are you sure that you always know who your victim are? When you said identifiable, I mean, it would rule out all sorts of protections, wouldn't it, we put in place. I mean, everything from seatbelts in cars to laws against animal cruelty, where it's a bit hard within the normal framework of rights to call the animal the victim, but we just think it's not the right thing for society to do, to simply allow these things. Is there no sense to your mind that that might be a good moral instinct?
Let us leave aside the question of cruelty to animals, where there may well be an identifiable victim, but things like seatbelt laws, no, there should be no seatbelt laws. There should be no command to wear crash helmets if you ride a bicycle.
Now, I want to get to the point here. Our time is short. Is that because essentially that contravenes your philosophy, or just because you don't think it works, or you think a different approach to lighter approach to lawmaking would be more effective? Which is it? Is it the philosophy or is it the practice?
Oh, it's all of them. Look, leave aside the philosophy.
Precisely.
The moment you call for power to be given to the state to regulate something, you are calling for power to be given into the hands of people you do not know, who are not accountable to you, who may not share your values, and who will probably use that power in ways that you find shocking.
And you never find that something that they protect you against might be worse worse. You would never find, for instance, that the use of hard drugs might be worse than somebody trying to stop you by law from doing so.
I certainly believe that aggressions should be punished, and perhaps the laws against aggression should be more vigorously policed than they are at the moment. But
The hard drug example?
acts which may or may not be preparatory to aggressions, no, there should be no laws against those. If you go home and beat your wife up, you should be put in prison. But if you drink a couple of bottles of whiskey, that is a matter for you.
And there would be no limit to that. There's no class of drug, there's no act of violence, if colluded in, which society should say, no, we think this is...
What do you mean by acts of violence colluded in?
Extreme sadomasochism, for instance, where real harm and threat to life occurs.
Oh, so long as there's consent, of course there should be no laws against it. None whatever.
Even if a life is threatened.
As long as there is valid consent, no, of course no laws.
Giles Fraser?
I just want to ask a couple of questions about the limits of, where you think the state should get involved. I mean, you said something about seatbelts. What about drink driving legislation? Do you think we should have the drink driving legislation that we have?
No, I don't. In the first place, people should be punished as and when they commit an aggression, but not for acts which may or may not be preparatory.
So someone who's going to
aggression.
go into it... So someone goes into a car, gets in a car and is absolutely, completely off their head. And you think that shouldn't be a crime for someone to drive a car off their head?
If he's driving without due care and attention, that is a crime in itself.
But I mean, would you not be anxious if you took away drink driving legislation that actually there will be thousands of dead bodies on the streets of people just like who are drunk, mowing them down?
Well,
you'd have that on your conscience.
OK, what you're doing is you're expressing very clearly one of the differences between a libertarian and an authoritarian. You seem to believe that unless people are hemmed in at every point by criminal laws, they will behave in a most beastly manner, whereas I believe that most people do not behave in a beastly manner.
Let's just do one other example, because I'm quite shocked by that. There's been quite a lot of stuff about paedophilia and paedophilia information exchange recently and so forth. Do you think the state should have a view about adults having sex with children?
Well, yes, because there you have the question of when does somebody become a consenting adult? And it's quite obvious that there is an age below which someone cannot give valid consent. But you see, I don't regard that as a valid point to make against libertarianism.
I'm just asking the question.
I've said that consenting adults should be free to do whatever they find convenient.
But the state should butt out as much as it can.
Yes.
Why don't you go away and live in Somalia?
Pardon?
Why don't you go away and live in Somalia?
No.
There's a failed state. There's no state going on in Somalia. We'd love it there, would you?
Again, you're making the usual authoritarian misconception that without all of these laws to hem us in, there will be anarchy, there will be chaos.
Well, there is anarchy and chaos in
Somalia.
Somalia.
There may be anarchy, but there's also chaos, whereas a society with fewer laws than we have may not be at all chaotic. Look, the present authoritarian state under which we live is a very recent construct. It began to grow seriously only 100 years ago. England before 1914 was not a notably chaotic place, yet until 1914, until 1920, you could wander into a gun shop without producing any identification. You could buy as many guns as you liked. You could wander into a pharmacy. You could buy heroin. You could buy cannabis. You could buy cocaine. Yet, in the absence of all the authoritarian laws under which we now live, England was not, so far as I can tell, a notably chaotic place before 1914.
Dr. Gabb, thank you very much indeed. The last two witnesses are fresher in our minds because they're more recently, but there was a direct contradiction there between Kathy Gingell, who said, once the law goes, behaviour will slip, rather ringingly, and then Dr. Gabb, who said, that the mistake was thinking that if people weren't hemmed in by criminal laws, they behave in a beastly fashion.
Yeah. I thought,
Michael.
Well, I thought Dr. Gabb was very refreshing in making those points. What he said about, as it were, England before 1914 not being chaotic, that in England you were able to buy cocaine and heroin. I have to take his word for it. I didn't know that. Yeah. I mean, those were very, very striking points. And I think, certainly I think with Kathy Gingell, there was that assumption that if the law didn't do things, that was kind of the end of it. And indeed, she said that as we become a more individualist society, I think this was her implication, that we're going to need more and more laws because we've become so individualistic. I thought this was all, rather depressing and really didn't leave much room for moral agency at all.
I was a bit worried that both of them had a moral nostalgia, led them in very different directions. But I think so that's always something to be very wary of in these debates, that you had in Cathy Gingell's sense an idea that it's slightly dystopian, everything will go to hell in a handcart unless you pass more and more laws. Well, to me that seems a very dubious way to pursue a moral agenda. But then I thought she was, as you said, Michael, very refreshing witness, very convincing really about a sort of core idea of the free agency. But this is not the case that you can compare a drugs policy in the 19th century. Look at the difference. There is not the availability in the slums of the 19th century is not the case of the availability on the council estate today.
The real question here is how do libertarians propose to protect the weak against the strong? And that's one of the most important things that laws are there for. And the idea that you just take all these laws down, the truth is there isn't a convincing account of how the weak are going to be protected. And it's just his very naive view of human nature that we're all good people and it's all fine.
It was very sad, and maybe it would be of some concern for you, Giles, to notice that with Cathy Gingell, that what she was saying was, I'm a Christian, I have moral norms, but they're on decline, and so far I've got to use the law. Now, what I think is that is an absolute abdication of responsibility by those people who believe in moral norms, that they don't go and fight for them and hide behind the law. We've now banned spitting of footballers, by the way. That's how bad the law is.
You
it's authoritarian. Certainly not.
Yeah, briefly, because we're running out of time, the other central thing was the idea of the victimless crime, because those on the other side of the argument said there's never, it isn't victimless.
There's lots of non-crimes that have victims too. I don't think everything should be. There's lots of things that you will do in everyday life that will make someone suffer. Not you personally, Michael, but in general.
Thank you.
And I use the example of infidelity, but I just said, if you have an affair, somebody's going to get hurt. Lots of victims there, children. I do not think we should make it against the law to have an affair, even though I might morally disapprove of being able to.
Not being able to name the victim does not mean that there is not real harm and that it is within bounds reasonable for the law to address that, and that's also a moral purpose of law.
That being the case, we better get on with making whiskey illegal.
That, dear listener, is where the programme ends, but believe me, the discussion won't. That's it for this week from our panel, Claire Fox, Anne McElvoy, Michael Portillo and Giles Fraser, and from me. Until the same time next week, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was chaired by Michael Burke. The producer was Phil Peagam.